It is always a pleasure to welcome everyone to our Zoom events. These programs allow women in philanthropy to reach a much larger audience, not only from Los Angeles, but from around the country and even from abroad. So again, welcome to you all. Our event this evening, Rebuilding LA, Ensuring Recovery for All, is a presentation by our very knowledgeable faculty from a variety of different departments across campus. I am Judith Angel, President of Women in Philanthropy. Women in Philanthropy celebrates and inspires women's giving throughout UCLA and fosters women's leadership on campus boards and programs. One of the things we do best is showcase the wonderful work that goes on at the university through events both on campus and on Zoom, such as this webinar tonight. This presentation should be very enlightening and informative. As you know, and unfortunately some of you all too well, Los Angeles experienced one of the most destructive and expensive disasters in its history with the devastating fires of January 2025. But UCLA immediately jumped into action and has continued to be part of the research and recovery efforts in the affected areas of Altadena, Pacific Palisades, and Malibu. Supervisor Lindsay Horvath has said that Los Angeles County cannot afford to simply rebuild what was lost. We must build for the future. This is our opportunity to rethink how we design communities, fortify infrastructure, and protect lives from the growing threats of the climate crisis. Los Angeles has an opportunity to lead the way in creating safer, climate-resilient communities that will stand for generations, rooted in equity as well as environmental justice, informed by community and guided by research. Last year, many UCLA experts participated in a partnership with the Blue Ribbon Commission on Climate Action and Fire-Safe Recovery to support a resilient and sustainable recovery. Tonight, we will hear from a panel of UCLA faculty from different areas of campus, many of whom worked with that Blue Ribbon Commission, and will discuss how our cities can build back better. Helping lead our discussion tonight is Julia Stein, Deputy Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and Environment at the UCLA School of Law. The Emmett Institute has played a key role in coordinating the convening, along with the Luskin Center for Innovation and Sustainable LA, the multidisciplinary UCLA team that worked with the Blue Ribbon Commission. Julia Stein helped lead the research team with her legal expertise, and it is that expertise that makes her the perfect person to facilitate the discussion with our panelists this evening. The panelists will each share information about their own research and then answer questions posed by Julia. After their conversation, the panelists will answer questions coming from the audience. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Julia will present as many of them as time allows. Hello, Julia. Thank you for being here with us tonight and guiding this important discussion. Having met you and the speakers, I know it is going to be an informative and interesting program. And with that, I hand it over to you.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Judith. As Judith said, I'm Julia Stein of the Law School's Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And my work in the recovery space focuses primarily on legal and governance structures that can best support communities as they're rebuilding. So building on the Blue Ribbon Commission work that Judith just mentioned, I've recently been working with the Office of Orange County Assembly Member Cotty Petrie Norris on state legislation that draws from some of the lessons we learned here in LA to help cities and counties across the state better prepare to recover sustainably from future disaster events. Over the last year and more than that, I've worked alongside a deep bench of UCLA experts who are all deeply committed to work in service of our city's recovery from the devastating January 2025 wildfires. And this evening's discussion is going to feature a panel of four of these scholar experts who are going to tell us more about their work regarding LA's fire rebuilding efforts and suggest some strategies for a more equitable, reimagined future. So I'm going to turn it over to them to tell you a little bit more about their work. We'll start with Dana Cuff, who's the director of UCLA's City Lab at UCLA School of Architecture and Urban Design. And then she'll be followed by David Eisenman, who's the director of UCLA's Center for Public Health and Disasters at the Fielding School of Public Health. And he'll be followed by Tim Kawahara, who's the founding executive director of UCLA's Ziman Center for Real Estate at the Anderson School of Management. And finally, we'll hear from Megan Mullen, who's the faculty director of UCLA's Luskin Center for Innovation at the Luskin School of Public Affairs. So I'm going to turn it over to the panelists and they'll offer you a little overview of their work in this space. And we'll start with Dana, who's been focused on recovery through the lens of architecture and community design.
Thanks, Julia. And thank you so much for having me here this evening. I am the founding director of City Lab, which began in 2006, which makes this our 20th anniversary. It's particularly appropriate to be speaking to women in philanthropy tonight because it's really women's support that has generated all of the good work and support that City Lab depends upon. City Lab's the only lab in the United States that uses design research for legible social impact, from public spaces to affordable housing to the authoring of California state legislation. We gather data to enrich creative outcomes that good design and appropriate design becomes more equitably distributed across the landscape. Juan, if you'd start the slides, that'd be great. I have a few slides because I can't really talk without showing something. And what I'm going to show you is the work we've been doing around the Eaton fire burn scar with the Altadena community. And what you see here is the outcome of a lot of community work that we undertook, meeting with something like 150 residents of the burn area who were trying to figure out how to come back to their home sites. We realized that their main concerns, of course, were to come back more quickly and more affordably. The natural solution in that case would probably be manufactured housing, an industry that's really transformed in the last 10 years. But very few Eaton area survivors had ever seen a prefabricated home. And so we're naturally skeptical. So what City Lab and its multiple partners, including the County of Los Angeles leadership, undertook was to stand up a showcase with 6 different full-scale prefabs so residents could really kick the tires. You could show the next slide. We didn't just have this 5-week showcase. We also wrote up our research report in ways that the community could understand and hold on to as a kind of reference through the housing handbook, which showed all the different prefab manufacturers that seemed relevant and at different price points with different features, from deep fire resilience to 3-bedroom, 2-bath, full-scale housing to ADU kinds of solutions, all of which would play a real role in the Altadena recovery, as well as a kind of evidence-based impact report of how well we thought we did. This has led to ongoing research and community action around prefabricated solutions, which are appropriate for just some of the Altadena residents. You could switch to the last slide. The other thing that City Lab works on, of course, is not just housing, which is one of our primary areas of expertise, but also community recovery there. As people are probably well aware, Altadena is home to a very diverse community and has a long and important Black heritage. And so we've helped a community organization with this exhibition about Black legacy in Altadena, which has now had 5 different events and venues. It continues to grow, and it's been a very rewarding and meaningful way to memorialize the community and the 19 lives that were lost in the Eden Fire. Thanks. Now I'm going to hand it over to David Eisenman. David's a physician and public health researcher who specifically examined longitudinal health outcomes in post-disaster scenarios. So he's a perfect person to listen to in the next introduction.
Well, thank you, Dana, for the introduction. So yes, I've been studying disasters for 25 years now, since Hurricane Katrina and 9/11. And so what I immediately understood about this fire within days was that this fire was different than any other fire I'd ever studied because it was really more residential burning than it was wildland burning. This was not really a wildfire. This was an urban fire ultimately. And so it was producing all of this air pollution, polluted water, ash, and pollution of the soil that was not pollution from burned trees and chaparral, but from all the stuff that's under people's sinks, all the uh, toxins that are in our fire-resistant furniture, for instance, and fire-resistant carpets. And all of that was getting into the air and getting into the soil and ultimately getting into people's homes. And not just into the homes that were right on the perimeter that withstood the fire that didn't burn down, but homes that were miles away because the plume really, the fire smoke plume really carried for dozens of miles, as anyone who's in LA remembers. As far down as really Palos Verdes, actually, and down below. So we really needed to find out, residents in LA really needed to find out right away, what was it that they were being exposed to? What were all the environmental toxins? And then long term, what were going to be the health consequences of all this exposure? And that meant capturing the data right away. Luckily, a philanthropist, the Spiegel Family Foundation, stepped forward with a 10-year commitment, which, by the way, was replacing federal research that had disappeared, and stood up the LA Fire Health Study Consortium, which brought together multiple universities, including UCLA, Harvard, and USC, and others. And we examined environmental exposures through air, water, soil, and ash. And now we're just getting started on looking at the health outcomes over the next 9 years, which will be the longest longitudinal study on wildfire effects ever done. Importantly, we had a whole community engagement section, which I will talk about later, where the questions we were going to address were generated by the community, and we would talk with the community about how to present the results back to them. All right, I'm going to now introduce my colleague, Tim Kawahara, who I've had the pleasure of working with on a number of climate change and disaster topics in the past through his leadership at the Ziman Center, and whose work on the financial and business aspects of this disaster are going to be interesting for all of us to hear.
Thank you very much, David. Appreciate the introduction. Again, my name is Tim Kawahara, Executive Director of the Richard S. Ziman Center for Real Estate. We are a multidisciplinary center housed here at the Anderson School of Management. And it quickly became clear to us, we obviously wanted to do something to help with the wildfires and the recovery. It's largely a real estate issue, so we decided that we needed to contribute in some way. So what we decided to do was pull together quickly. Within 2 weeks, we brought together a group of 50 CEO level real estate executives across multiple subject matter expertise. And we came up with this report called Project Recovery. It's a 180-page report, and it's essentially a roadmap to recovery. Again, it's focused primarily on kind of the business aspects of rebuilding. So vertical rebuilding, insurance market reform, capital markets, and how to finance these types of recovery efforts. And it was released, I think, within 30 days of the fire. So we really worked very quickly to put this together. I should also mention that I was born and raised on the border of Altadena, Pasadena, so I'm very familiar. I know probably 40 families that have lost their homes up there. My own mom had to evacuate. Thankfully, her home was fine, but she was displaced for a period of time. And so, like Dana, I'm very concentrated on the Altadena fire, although I've also been doing a lot of work in both Palisades and Malibu. So that's why I'm here and happy to be part of the conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Megan Mullen, who earlier was mentioned is part of the Luskin School. And she's really an expert in kind of resiliency and governance. And I'll turn it over to Megan.
Thanks, Tim. As Tim said, I direct the Luskin Center for Innovation here at UCLA, and we partner with government agencies, community groups, and other partners on environmental policy research. And I want to take a step back and highlight that a confluence of different factors contributed to the historic destruction of these fires. There was extreme fire weather that was intensified by climate change. There were concurrent ignitions across the region, and there were vulnerabilities in our urban infrastructure, our communications infrastructure, our water infrastructure, our evacuation infrastructure, and vulnerabilities in our built environment that all contributed to these fires becoming the most destructive in the region's history. And an early conversation after the fires emphasized, understandably, building back quickly and getting people back in their spaces as rapidly as possible. And there was little attention to building back safely with more resilience to the risks that had just become so visible. And there was some questioning and even some backtracking on measures that had already been deliberated and undertaken to improve building safety and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are part of what's fueling these destructive fires that our region is seeing. And so in light of this emerging conversation, there was a LA County supervisor, Lindsay Horvath, who wanted to advance an alternative narrative about rebuilding not just quickly, but also with recognition of the region's endemic risk, and as well as the region's climate leadership. And so she announced this Blue Ribbon Commission you've heard mentioned to develop recommendations on creating a more fire-safe, climate-resilient recovery and help communities prepare for a future of high fire risk. She brought together 20 civic leaders, mostly from LA, but also nationally, which brought practitioner expertise from a range of different sectors. And then she recruited UCLA to partner with the commission. And we brought research knowledge, as well as the ability to convene leaders from the communities who were harmed by the fires to inform the commission's recommendations. So this model sort of brought together like practitioner expertise, practitioner knowledge, academic knowledge, and local knowledge, right? An organized body of thought based on immediacy of experience. And over a really short period, although not as short as Tim's, which was so impressive, our work was concentrated in just 4 months. We tapped about 50 scholars, overwhelmingly at UCLA, but others across the system, to bring their expertise to support the commission. And the commission developed about 60 recommendations for rebuilding resiliently across a range of domains: insurance to infrastructure, defensible space to restoring commercial corridors, workforce housing to safety protections. We at UCLA produced a companion report that summarized the research informing these recommendations and really highlighting like where research can help us in guiding policy change and where the research is still unclear and where we have gaps that we need to address as a research community. So I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A what some of these recommendations said. We also heard from communities in our engagement, heard a lot about the lost trust in government that emerged out of these fires, even as fire survivors were seeking a strong government hand in guiding recovery. I had the good fortune of partnering with Julia Stein, our moderator today, in helping to lead the UCLA effort, and I'll turn it back over to her now. Thanks.
Thanks, Meg. That's, I think, a perfect point to jump into our conversation. As you were just talking about, there's been a huge push for Los Angeles communities to recover from the fires quickly. And we also want them to recover safely and smartly. So I would love for us to talk about steps that can be taken to ensure that communities recover in ways that set them up to weather the next disaster well. And maybe I'll start with you, Meg, to talk a little bit more about, what we uncovered in the Blue Ribbon Commission process, but I'd like to also invite all of our panelists to talk a little bit about what their work and their research is revealing on this topic.
Yeah, in the big picture, I think the most important thing to say is that it's a lot easier to find our values and act on them before a disaster hits than in a disaster's wake. We can think more expansively about what's possible when we're not also trying to meet the immediate needs of people who are suffering. And this is an easy thing to say, but it's a harder thing to act on. We need to build a culture of preparation that keeps these conversations alive, even as, memories beyond the immediate communities, those memories will never fade. But even as attention in the region drifts, and we need to create specific tools that can be unlocked when a disaster hits. And in the specific space of what can we do, I think we can think about our region's resilience and risk, or the flip side, the risk exposure, as being a combination of exposure and vulnerability. There's a lot of people, who want to draw attention to, should we even be living in these fire risk areas? About 20% of LA County's 3.5 million housing units are located in what could be called the WUI, the wildland urban interface. So we have many hundreds of thousands of housing units that are exposed to fire danger. And we saw in the Eaton fire that even places that we think of as not being super highly exposed themselves can be exposed. And so reducing that exposure, moving people out of, wildfire exposed areas, that's not a manageable solution, right? So what we can also do is think about reducing the vulnerability of the people who are living and working in those spaces. And there's a lot more possibility. A California home that's built after 2007 is about 40% less likely to be destroyed than one built in 1990 that's facing the same risk. About 90% of the county's housing stock was built before 1990, right? So we have a lot of homes and structures that we could strengthen and make more resilient, make more protected through things like eaves and decks and roofs and siding to help improve them. That's costly. We need to think about pairing hardening standards. I know Dana doesn't like the word hardening, so she can push back a bit. But we can think about pairing, right, like higher standards with or funding or what have you with insurance reform so that people have some confidence that investing in strengthening their homes will be worthwhile. But there are ways to reduce our vulnerability and ways that the science is really clear does it, right? Like these aren't open science questions. We know how to make some of these structures more resilient, and we can do it if we have the will and the supporting institutions.
Just want to build off of what Megan's saying, because this sort of tension between building back better and more resiliently and building back quickly is a real tension. And you can imagine that the people whose homes burned, as David pointed out, it was a residential fire to the greatest extent. That their main concern is getting back. And the longer it is before they can rebuild, the more likely they are to never move back. So the urgency of recovery is real. It's not just people wanting what they had before. It's also an impossibility of getting back if you've been dispersed in that diaspora post-disaster. In one way, I see the rebuilding effort as being one that doesn't endanger further resilient solutions as time moves on past the disaster, but to come up with some very smart early recovery strategies like building prefab ADUs on sites so that people can get back to their land and back and reform the community. And then we could really take the hardening after what I consider the kind of softer solutions, like the cultural solutions, more seriously. So I don't see these things as an infinite contradiction, but that tension really, I think we have to be super sensitive to the trauma and the ability to bring people back quickly and affordably. To me, the solutions are the ones that Tim was talking about in a large part. If we could get the infrastructure of recovery, the insurance industry, the financing industry, the planning industry, to support smart recovery, like if we had an emergency or disaster oriented system in which recovery could happen, that would make a lot of sense moving forward.
Yeah, and I would follow up too with Megan's comments. Certainly, we want to build back more resiliently, and that's actually sort of, as you mentioned, being done because the building codes have changed. They also have a higher standard of building, Chapter 7A in the California Building Code for building in areas that are high risk for wildfire. And the question is whether that should be we should increase those areas because, as you mentioned, Megan, homes that we wouldn't have thought would be at risk of wildfire burned down. So maybe we need to think about that. Another issue is that the insurance companies right now don't currently consider if you are building back more resiliency in terms of your premiums and everything else. So, and then in terms of we're supposed to be focused on equity, building back more wildfire-proof homes does come with a premium, and folks right now are having a really difficult time penciling out the financial aspects of rebuilding. So, of course, we want to build back more resiliently. We have to, but there's also some financial considerations with respect to individual homeowners that need to be addressed as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just pick up on some of the industry particulars and policy approaches. I mean, in public health, what really makes a difference is policy reform. And one of the things that I'm seeing from a public health point of view is the need for public policy reform around smoke damage. So just a little bit of explainer, this smoke from the wildfires carries all kinds of toxins, chemicals, metals, particles that can get into your lung and cross into your brain and other organs, and toxic and incredible in many ways. And it gets into people's homes and it gets into the soft sides of their home. It gets into the furniture, the drywall, the insulation, and the gas parts of it get into there and then over time slowly emanate out, called off-gassing. And you can't even smell it. It's not, these aren't always chemicals that are have an odor. Um, a year after the fire now, in some studies, 50% of the standing homes that have been tested have still have contamination above safe levels. And people also are having a hard time getting that testing even done. Insurance is refusing to do the testing. The free programs that UCLA and other institutions have set up are limited, and Department of Public Health, and they're not well known. And then when people call in a remediation specialist, it's not a regulated industry. And so then when they're retested, a lot of them are failing, like 60% are failing clearance after, quote, professional remediation. So what we're looking at, what I'm sort of looking at are policy approaches that right now are making its way through the California legislature, um, which are pretty straightforward. There are two bills, one that would establish what safe means for remediation, so health-based standards for when your home has been remediated from these chemicals. And the second bill would be about requiring the insurance industry to pay for achieving that, and keeping people in temporary housing paid for until that clearance is met.
And on the environmental front, the two fires are a little bit different in the sense that Altadena structures were much older. Some of those structures were built in the 1800s before lead paint was outlawed. And so you're seeing different levels of toxicity in the Eaton fire versus the Palisades fire.
Yeah, and I think, what this conversation is highlighting is just the importance of some thinking before the next disaster about what do we do here, right? I mean, Meg, you're pointing out there's a significant amount of the population in LA County that lives in the WUI. We know that we've got a lot of fire-prone areas. We know this isn't the last time that we're going to see this happen in a residential area. And I think this is why one of the things that we realized really quickly as part of Blue Ribbon Commission work was that we needed a structure in place to be able to spring into action the next time that one of these events occurs, that it's much easier to do some of that planning in advance and have something, waiting in the wings where government can spring into action and we have some decisions about how to streamline things for folks who are trying to come back. Because to your point, Dana, people want to get back to their communities quickly, and the best way to do that is to make sure that there's a structure in place already to help support them in doing that. So that's one of the things that we've been working on with the legislature, and I think that kind of is a perfect segue into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the disparate outcomes that we have seen, not only across the two burn areas, but within those two communities as well. Tim, as you were pointing out, this is very resource dependent, the process of rebuilding, and folks are struggling. And so as we're thinking about equitable recovery, I'd love for folks to talk a little bit more about what the barriers are that we're seeing across the two communities and how we can try to address some of those barriers. And maybe, Tim, I'll start with you there.
Yes, thanks, Julia. Yeah, so the biggest issue really at this standpoint, a lot of the environmental remediation has been done, although there's still work that needs to be done. But people have, it's really comes down to people are either underinsured or didn't have insurance at all. In Altadena, for example, a lot of those homes were passed down through generations, and without a mortgage, you don't really need insurance. But we did some surveying. You're right. If the longer it takes to rebuild, the less likely you're going to actually move back in. But right now, everybody estimates that they have at least the 30%, 40% gap in what their insurance companies are covering and what the true cost of construction is. And so whether you're in the Palisades, which is a slightly higher, more resourced area, or the Eaton fire in Altadena, you still have a huge gap that you need to make up. And, not everybody in the Palisades or Malibu are wealthy. There's a lot of teachers that bought homes in the 60s and 70s, and they're having a very difficult time closing that gap between what they're being insured for and true cost of construction. So we need to find some ways to help lower the cost of construction. Dana's doing some of that work with modular. We also came up with a suggestion that they bring in home builders. A lot of the folks in the Palisades that we met with initially said, we don't want tract housing. We don't want our community to look like Orange County. We wanted, apologies to anybody from Orange County. That's what the Palisades people said. And they wanted to preserve kind of the architectural style of it. But now they're realizing that, a home builder can come in. You have one architect, you have one general contractor, they can buy at scale, and they can really rebuild at maybe $500 or $600 a square foot, maybe versus maybe 13, 14, up to 2,000 for a fully custom home. So we need to find ways to both reduce the cost of construction and figure out how to get more money in the pockets of people that are trying to rebuild. And unfortunately, we're also, talking about equity, we're also seeing a lot of burned lots being sold to investors. Corporations are bought up over half the burned lots now, and people are realizing they just can't afford to rebuild. And so there's going to be a lot of displacement. And I know Dana, working up in Altadena, there's a huge concern that traditionally Black African American community, and particularly West Altadena, is going to be displaced because of the finances. And so we need to really think about that. And a last thing that I'll mention here is I think that philanthropy really needs to play a big role. I know this group is Women in Philanthropy, but there are foundations that are doing things like Dana, I don't know if about the Green Line Housing Foundation in Altadena, but Pasadena Community Foundation raised a huge philanthropic fund. They are giving funds to Black developers to buy and rebuild homes in traditionally Black areas of Altadena, and then selling it back below market rate to the folks that actually live there. So there are some really innovative things that are being done to try to be more equitable in the rebuild, but many, many challenges still exist.
I think we've all had this experience, which is you talk to people whose homes burned or whose businesses burned, and each one is its own independent trauma. I mean, after a day of working on site at like that showcase, I was a wreck, and it wasn't my house that burned, but you hear these stories. And so single solutions are really hard to find because each story has its own unique profile, really, of what kind of insurance, what kind of rebuilding, what kind of plan, what kind of family, what their finances are. So finding these singular solutions is particularly complicated, I think, in a post-disaster scenario, which is why we often see these massive governmental intrusions like the tsunami barrier in the Sendai region, or just rebuilding back what was there in the Katrina scenario. Basically, there are a lot of failed outcomes, in part because it's so hard to adjust for the individual problematics. But for sure, it's going to take innovative and creative approaches like you're talking about, Tim, to think through what kind of financing could be implemented to hold that property so that people could come back and we could think more creatively and scientifically about the rebuild. I know the county in the Eaton Fire area has been purchasing some of the business lots that went up for sale so that they didn't become speculative development opportunities, and that they could take some time to think how the commercial corridors could become community anchors once again. So I think those kind of solutions, community land trusts, are, kind of informally organizing, if that's a possibility with individual property owners.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning too in terms of rebuilding. We can't forget that it's not just individual homes, but it's also the civic infrastructure. It's the churches, the synagogues, the parks, the schools. All of that needs to be rebuilt as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm learning a lot by hearing all this from you both. I guess one of the things I'm thinking a lot about is how all of this intersects with larger forces that are going to go on, that are going on in the nation and California at the same time. So just, to be clear about some of the fragmentation that I'm seeing in our work, we're seeing in the research in our group that the Black and Latino community members who are survivors of the fires are more likely than the white survivors to be experiencing homelessness, to be experiencing food insecurity, to be falling behind on bills, to Tim's point. And then other groups that we're part of who are looking at based on renters versus owners, which kind of maps onto some of the same inequities. Renters are facing much like a 4-time rate of homelessness compared to homeowners, and also are much less likely to have their homes tested, going back to this contamination issue, because they have a lot less sway on what the landlord does. And so I'm really concerned about the health effects. What's going on then on a more macro level is what really I want to get to. We're seeing right now at the federal level something that's really going to compound problems, which is HR 1, signed into law July 4th, 2025, cut nearly $1 trillion from Medicaid nationally, the largest reduction in the program's 60-year history. And California is specifically up to 3.5 million Californians are projected to lose Medi-Cal coverage because of the new work requirements and the eligibility redeterminations and other restrictions that are going to take effect. And LA County is going to suffer, or is suffering a lot. I mean, I've heard from our Department of Public Health that's already closing clinics. They're really concerned about how this is going to hit and how they're going to be able to take care of their community clinics and their public clinics. There's a projected 500,000 fewer Medi-Cal enrollees in the next year in the state. And so you have this confluence of greater need from all that we know from the fire. The fire's out, the flames are gone, but the long tail, the health effects are going to happen for the next many years. And the confluence of that with the loss of ability to obtain care. I'm not even talking about all the challenges around immigration, of course, in California and Los Angeles too, which is a whole nother topic, but I don't have time to get into. But again, a lot of barriers to healthcare.
It's so great that you're doing this longitudinal study of that, David, so that we have that information moving forward. But it's terrifying hearing you talk about it. One of the things we learned from the Santa Rosa fire corresponds to what you're saying, which is that the ability to rebuild has a lot to do with the community's resilience in and of itself. So if community is organized, for instance, in the distrust of the safety of the soils moving back, for instance, that's been an organized effort on the part of people in burn areas that's really at least made the issue public. And I think that's one of the side effects of the fragmentation problem, is that it's making it harder for people to organize in order to have effective outcomes. The civil rights case now in Altadena about why they were not notified at the same time as the people who lived on the east side of the old discrimination segregation line of Lake Avenue has become a source for community organization that's going to be really important, I think, in the recovery. So the more that we can do each in our own areas to help communities organize, I think the more likely we are to get some kinds of positive impacts for these ongoing and turbulent recovery issues like the one you're bringing up.
Yeah, when I think about what are the barriers to equitable recovery, I think the biggest barrier is when individual renters, homeowners, business owners are left on their own to figure it out. And that's what we're seeing, is because of coordination and fragmentation among local governing authorities, because of an absence of federal funds that would help shore up those local governing authorities, and also provide some kind of coordinating infrastructure from, the federal government that we often would have seen post-disaster because of the decline of social supports that David just outlined that help individuals provide a safety net for individuals as they're left on their own. Because of all of those things, each individual, right, grappling with their own unique stories in the way Dana outlined, they're left on their own to figure it out, to battle the insurance companies, to battle their landlords, to find a new rental in a market where there's many fewer than there had been before. And we're not seeing the kind of, government led coordination that would not eliminate those inequities, but at least help close some of those gaps, at least help propel the process so that folks could get back sooner, and in that way make it easier to get back overall, coordinate, potentially property sales, coordinate the ability for individual blocks, right, to jointly contract with, a set of builders, to jointly negotiate for different kinds of community solutions. All of that takes some coordinating authority, and we're seeing it emerge through community-based organizations, through really fantastic inspirational leaders, who have emerged and started to work with one another in all of the fire affected communities. But they're doing it, on a shoestring and by their own will and, lack of sleep. And we need to be able to fuel all of those efforts because the inequity is driven by people having to act alone.
Meg, you and Dana already started touching on this, but these are two neighborhoods, Altadena and the Palisades, that we really strongly associate with particular types of neighborhood character and community. And Dana, you've talked about the importance of community in rebuilding and in bringing folks back after a disaster event. And so I'd love to hear from you all now a little bit about the role that community voices are kind of already playing in the recovery and can continue to play, and what community-driven recovery looks like. And maybe Dana, I'll start with you.
Well, sort of we operate on the principle that everything we do is community-led. And obviously, if we aren't, as a university, bringing the highest levels of scholarship, like the people who are in this room have, we're not doing our part. But it has to come from community in the broadest sense. And in that, in the Eaton Fire area, the variety of houses that were there's probably more nostalgia for the craftsmen than there actually were craftsman houses. But it's because it was so uneven and varied and like built by hundreds of different builders. 9,000 structures were burned. There were 6,000 homes. There were very few repetitive houses. The Janes houses were these amazing 6-bedroom homes that were built by kind of a corrupt developer at the time, but they were inhabited for generations by multi-generational families. It's going to be hard to get those back, but there are a number of now different strategies that have emerged. There's one group of people that's taking buildings that are being condemned in other parts of the city and moving them along the freeways at night to put them in place in Altadena. That's not going to provide very many, but it's going to give some of the variety. There's a very nice group of young architects working on Foothill Catalog to get pre-approved plans that are craftsman-like. I mean, we don't have that industry anymore, the craftsmen that built the houses that Tim was referring to, some of them coming from the 19th century. 20th century. So in any case, I think prefab has a real role to play in that. There's a lot more variety in that industry than ever before. Some 500 different manufacturers exist in the United States. That's 500 different look and feel, and each one has multiple models. So I think there are ways to get back the variety that is the main issue in my mind, that people want it to be a custom community, a place where they see their own identities reflected in the eventual outcome. And I haven't even talked about the business scape, but I'll let someone else address that.
You know, I've heard now Megan and Dana talk a bit about this last through a couple of answers, and it strikes me as a disaster researcher. You know, we know that by definition of disaster, the need always outstrips the supply of anything. That's so there's never going to be enough help, and that's where resilience fills in, just on sort of broad conceptual level. But it strikes me that maybe actually we've gotten even less help in LA than I was even aware about, or we are at the top levels in LA helping our own communities even less than I'm aware of. I see the same thing that Dana talks about, which is this idea that um, grassroots organizations are filling in the gap where really bureaucracies, administrations, government agencies should have been doing their work. And I'm just going to name one, which is called Eaton Fire Residents United. And they are a voluntary grassroots collective. And what they did is really remarkable. They coordinated professional lab reports from all those remediations that I told you about that were going on. They coordinated them from over 250 homes, and they produced data on what were those post-remediation failure rates that I talked about. And they turned that into the legislation that I was mentioning earlier, the assembly bills that are making their way through the California Assembly. There was no funding for this. There was no mandate. Their findings are, as I said, now the foundation for the legislation. And this is both remarkable and should be really uncomfortable for us because it means that the most important environmental health surveillance in this recovery was done by volunteers because the institutions responsible just didn't do it. And, you know, I'll add into that the work of our own consortium, the LA Fire Health Consortium, which, as I said, had 10 universities, Cedars-Sinai in there also, funded by now two philanthropy groups behind our work. You know, again, stepping in where Department of Public Health and others weren't doing it. One of the things that we did in terms of community engagement, though, is structure it so that we had community engagement boards that we went to ask them what did they want to know, what did they want us to do research on, and then when we found the results, we went to them right away to ask how do we message this, how do we communicate this, and how do we do that fast, not waiting for any scientific paper to come out, but just getting into the community right away. And I think that's really an important thing. And I just want to make one last point, which is to actually uplift what UCLA did. You know, UCLA is a public institution and it really rose like no other institution in Los Angeles. And you're seeing that here and hearing that here tonight from our speakers. Our academic community turned toward the disaster, often unfunded and still unfunded, to gather the data and to use it for the betterment of everyone affected. And I think we should really count ourselves for the moment as part of that community, rightfully.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning. Dana mentioned the way Altadena fire was interesting from this equity standpoint because there is this north-south dividing street called Lake Avenue that Dana mentioned. The east side of it was actually redlined, and to this day remains much more wealthy and wider. And then the west side, that's where you saw a lot of the brown and black folks who were actually able to afford homes. And unfortunately, that's the area, ironically, it's further away from Eaton Canyon, but received the most damage. To this day, when you look at the recovery efforts, you're seeing much more recovery rebuilding on the east side of Lake Avenue than the west side of Lake Avenue. So it's just indicative of kind of these structural issues that continue to show their face.
Received the most damage and also failed to be notified in a timely
And
manner
yes,
in
and
order
failed
to
to be
save people's
notified.
lives. Right?
My mother lives on the east side, and she got a notification an hour after the fire. And it wasn't until almost the next day that the folks on the west side got notified. In terms of community, at least in Altadena, I'm seeing a lot of faith-based efforts and other grassroots efforts too. So they are really trying to keep and Dana's can appreciate this, but they're really trying to keep a tight community and preserve the culture and all of that in Altadena. And Dana, as you probably know, I mean, Altadena was already experiencing gentrification concerns even prior to the fire. So this has just exacerbated the situation there.
As some residents say, they had scientists living everywhere. There were people from JPL on one side and like people from Disney engineering on another. And so when you needed information about what was going on, there was always someone who had expert knowledge in that area, and partly because it was changing.
David's example is one. David's example is one of many of groups like filling in, not just in community convening and bringing each other together, but also providing key information resources or continuing to run materials drives, like, you know, to meet people's essential needs. A whole list, right? Providing health-based services, providing design services, right? Connecting people with architects and builders and other, you know, rebuild opportunities, navigating permitting processes. That's all, you know, it is happening. In some places, it's even they're connecting with one another, like through the collaboratory in the Eaton Fire area, where all the different groups physically come together in the same space and have opportunities to exchange information. But again, that is taxing on the people doing it, right? These are folks who are volunteering their own time. You know, it starts to fray. They're, you know, experiencing the trauma over and over again as they're doing it, and threadbare, right, without the social supports. Another thing I want to highlight that's happening in both the Palisades area and in the Eaton area, and I was just at an event this past weekend among West Altadena residents, is that there are community conversations that are meeting people where they're at, but they are starting to bring resilience into those conversations, right? And the conversations, while resilience and hardening and future fire isn't the first thing on people's minds, and they're nervous about it because it adds expense and potentially adds delay, they also want to grapple with it because it is an equity question, right? The wealth in in all fire affected areas, people's wealth in Los Angeles is overwhelmingly caught up in property. And, you know, for Altadena residents who, you know, are have multi-generation homes, their overwhelming wealth is caught up in this property. In a lot of these Palisades homes that we think of as being extraordinarily high values, I think Tim highlighted earlier, right? It's teachers and nurses who bought a long time ago, and their wealth is caught up in their property. So people are starting to realize this could happen again, and I don't want to rebuild and be in the same situation again, not only for the trauma, but also I need to have this wealth to retire on or pass on to my children, or, you know, this is our economic opportunity and our pathway out. And those conversations are happening partly because they're starting from within the community, right? Through these engagements that community members are facilitating.
One of the
There,
things,
there has been similar community-based efforts in the Palisades we should mention as well. There's Pally Strong, and um, the one thing they have going for them is Rick Caruso. Rick Caruso may not be the mayor of LA, but he certainly is the mayor of Palisades Recovery. So he's been really done a lot of advocacy work and has helped expedite rebuilding, particularly the village up there.
Yeah, the Palisades Recovery Coalition has been engaged in lots of conversations and facilitation and connectivity, and other groups too, but they're one that's really pushed a lot of this forward.
one of the things that strikes me as a topic that I'd be interested to hear from other people in this group talk about, which is the willingness of everyone to try to make things go faster, be more resilient, be respectful of the residents. And yet the speed of recovery is so slow compared to what we all would wish it to be, especially watching in the county where the county supervisor and the planning permitting process, which is where I was most involved, it's almost impossible to remove the sludge, even though everyone wants to. And I mean bureaucratic sludge, not the kind of debris that was after the fire. And I think that idea of what a post-disaster governance structure might be is probably a really important thing for us to think about in terms of the disasters moving forward. That we ought to have a FEMA-like, or maybe some of you will say, no need to compare to FEMA, but some kind of disaster model in which there could be a more hierarchical decision making that allows for smart, fast recovery.
Dana, that's precisely what the bill that I've been working on with Assemblymember Petrie Norris's office would do, is actually create a tool for local governments to do that kind of thinking before a disaster happens and put a structure in place so that, we can spring into action. We can make sure that things are done equitably and sustainably moving into the future.
Thank you. That's really, really appropriate. Now, if we get the insurance companies to work with that too, and the banks, we might have a workable way through this.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Megan, then I'm going to switch us over to audience questions, but please.
Yeah, I had to say the word accountability, right? They're just, what moves things forward is being able to know who's in charge. And so what you're describing, Dana, what Julie is working on is a way to bring that kind of accountability, because then folks who are running into trouble, they know where to go, right? They know they have an outlet.
Absolutely.
Kind of ironic, but my phone kept pinging, and it's watch duty because there are 2 fires in Lancaster right now, and looks like they've increased about 300 acres just since we've been on this call.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to take us over to, since I know we're coming up on time, I'm going to take us over to audience questions. So the first one is, building more resilient is great, but that doesn't make a difference if the state land surrounding the areas isn't cleared of brush, reservoirs aren't filled, fire hydrants aren't operable, power is not turned off, power poles and equipment aren't replaced with more fire-resistant models because of environmental plant concerns, and fire department and equipment isn't adequately funded. So what are your suggestions in terms of city, county, and state failures that repeatedly have not been addressed so this doesn't happen again?
Well, that's a big question.
Well, Meg, I wonder if you might want to talk to the fire resilience district that we thought about as part of the Blue Ribbon Commission efforts. I mean, I think this is one area where we're thinking about the need to collectively focus on infrastructure moving into the future, and then maybe we can talk more from there.
Yeah, I mean, the question is spot on, right? We've focused a lot in this conversation about homeowners, renters, business owners, and not as much about the collective infrastructure that can be a source of risk reduction and can certainly be a part of response, right, when something strikes. And the stories are different, right? There are places where it seems like there were some it appears there were some real failures in what we really needed to have happen. Like, it is hard to look at anything that has emerged publicly and not say anything except that there was egregious communication failure. And then there are other places where the story's a little more complicated, right? Water systems that were not built to handle urban conflagrations. And so if we want to ask water systems to tackle urban conflagrations, are we ready to pay for that? And who should pay for that? And how should we think about that going forward, right? So this, as we look at the different threads of infrastructure, they all look different from one another. The commission recommended the creation of a fire mitigation district for the LA region, right? And they weren't decisive on exactly what that looks like and what gets covered and exactly what the structure would be. But the idea that we should bring, fire protection, firefighting professionals together with, strategies and activities to reduce fire risk, whether it's hardening activities, infrastructure investment activities, maybe vegetated green buffers, and create some coordinating system, right, to fund and prioritize among all of these different kinds of activities. We've seen something like that in Marin County. It seems to be pretty effective. And that's a possible strategy, that's a possible sort of approach going forward. I think we're at the stage now in Los Angeles where everybody's still digesting how widespread the fire risk is in the region. I think, it's long been recognized that there were concentrated areas of high fire risk. And I think these fires have forced us all to take that step back, and the region's going to have to grapple with how much are we willing to spend to reduce that risk, and how do we balance it against other priorities for public investment.
Yeah, the financial institutions like banks and insurance companies are already have armies of client scientists. They're redoing the models so they can figure out risk assessment and whether they would even insure in an area or provide a mortgage in an area. And yes, the infrastructure is critically important. It's very expensive to underground power lines. It's about $1 million a mile. So you add up all the miles in the Palisades alone, and that's $1 billion tab. We would typically depend on federal dollars, disaster dollars to address this. But California is obviously not the most favorite state of the current administration, so federal dollars have been slow. But yeah, undergrounding power lines just to start with will be really critical. SCE is doing a little bit of that in the extreme foothill areas of Altadena, and of course some of it's being done in the Palisades as well. Just have to figure out the cost, but it's this is a once in a life opportunity to actually harden the infrastructure itself so that we can protect ourselves from things going forward.
I want to point to a really important report that came out in the last week from the California Earthquake Authority. The CEA was tasked with answering really like the big questions about how California can create new systems to finance and force more resilience to all of the disaster risks that exist in the state. And so and it was called SB 254 that ordered this report. And it was how to enhance resilience to natural disasters, not only fire, but also earthquakes, flooding, and how insurance and utility systems and community and property level mitigation can start to work more hand in hand with one another and be more reinforcing for one another. The report was tasked to the California Earthquake Authority. A colleague of ours, Julia's and mine, Lori Johnson, who served on the commission, led this report. It came out last week. It is loaded with really good, thoughtful information. And I know that the California legislature is looking deep at it. Committee chairs are like studying it in order to prepare legislation. But for folks who are really interested in like, how do we think seriously about shoring up our infrastructure? This report is a place that we're going to start looking to start, because like, how do we get how are we going to finance that kind of undergrounding, and how are we going to create the incentives for all these things to balance against one another?
And it could even be something as simple as just correcting ingress egress. I mean, the poor people in the Pacific Palisades had one road in and out, and they ended up having to bulldoze those cars. So maybe even thinking about urban design and the way we create these pathways in and out.
When you come to the infrastructure questions, I think maybe there's a place where we find some optimism, and that's because it requires us thinking together, right? I mean, in the exact opposite of people hiring private fire protection, which is a concept I can hardly process, right? That I'm going to protect my house with my private fire service and not the one that's burning right next to me. How does that even possible? But it's not so dissimilar from insurance companies not giving benefits for whole communities building resiliently. Instead, we have to be thinking collectively if we're going to solve these problems. And when the entire state of California is subjected to the kinds of issues that the California Earthquake Authority report suggests, we have to start thinking together again. And maybe the last example we really saw that was after the Great Depression, right? Where in fact, the banking industry was reformed, the collective notion of what it meant to lift people out of poverty and to provide housing was a national agenda. Even if our national circumstances might not favor California, in California, we could organize collectively to deal with the increasing emergency conditions that we find ourselves in, and maybe start thinking together again about that taxation has some benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to this conversation, but I want to point out one thing. As a disaster researcher for 25 years, um, it's fantastic to hear this energy right now. We're going to continue to have it here in Los Angeles, but many others are going to tire of it. And there'll be a point the political forces will want to not hear about it any longer, possibly. That happens in other states where they're not making enough progress. They don't really want to have it up in front of everyone's face anymore. Maybe that's a little different in California. So, I think we are going to have other disasters, of all different sizes, even coming up next summer, possibly, right? And we have to use them all as opportunities to forward the kind of agenda that maybe this new Earthquake Authority report outlines, or maybe it's an agenda that people like Julia and Megan can start to organize, following up on the Blue Ribbon Commission, and think about having an agenda for a cultural preparedness as well as an infrastructure preparedness that's long term, and that doesn't get tired from people's wanting to move on.
Yeah, I think we need to learn from this. These disasters are gonna happen again, and if we just build back the same way, we're gonna have the same result. So
I want to ask us one last question, but before I do that, I know a number of us are working on things that are moving through the legislature right now, and I had folks ask in the Q&A if we could say the bill numbers in case folks want to advocate for the passage of those bills. So, David, I know you've got a couple that are moving through the assembly right now.
Yes, so I'm going to mention three. I didn't get to mention the third, really. First are the two bills I did mention about insurance. That's AB 1642 and AB 5. Now, I don't have the third as a number, but I want you to keep your eyes open. there's going to be a bond measure in the state come November that's going to allow California to build its own NIH, its own California National Institute of Health, if you want it. To and we were caught in many ways without the support of the federal government and giving us the science support that we've needed. We were really lucky that philanthropy is available in Los Angeles and Southern California, but it had to really replace what was an NIH and an NSF that went away in the new administration. So this bond measure would create a state level research funding capacity that would have addressed a lot of the public health issues that we're talking about right here, right now. So without giving you a number, I'd like everyone to just keep an eye on that come November.
That's great. Thanks, David. And the bill that I've mentioned a couple of times is AB 2385 by Assemblymember Petrie Norris. And that's the one that would help local governments do some pre-disaster planning to make sure that they can respond effectively in the wake of a disaster and recover effectively. Okay. We could keep talking all night, I know. And this has been a really wide-ranging conversation. And I think one of the things that has emerged is that there's still so much to be done and huge issues to tackle here in Los Angeles. And so, thinking about all of that and the work that you've been doing, what's giving you hope as you look into the future of Los Angeles's recovery and rebuilding from these fires? And David, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I'm kind of proud of UCLA, and I'm proud of all the different organizations. I find it fantastic that Women in Philanthropy has this kind of interest. We have, over 100, I think, several, I don't know, a lot of participants. Hearing the work from my colleagues, which is really inspiring, knowing that our new chancellor was inspired, came to UCLA, started 6 days before the fires. UCLA has really stood up in the response and the recovery and has invested, and it really makes me proud and gives me a lot of hope.
I agree with David. The UCLA's response has been great, thoughtful, extensive. It's the public university that I always want to be part of, which is to have a public role with real public impacts. I have to say, my greatest optimism and joy comes from working directly with community, with the solutions that they're seeking, with the sort of I don't know, communities don't want to be resilient, right? They just have to be. And I'm always impressed with how generous people are who are in the middle of one of the most traumatic things that ever happened in their lives, and how willing they are to try to work through and fight for what they deserve. So that's what energizes me and keeps me in the long run, like David, staying with this burn survivors networks to help in any way that I can.
I'm going to thread the needle between those two and say Sam James and her colleagues, who is a Luskin School of Public Affairs, Master's in Public Policy student, and a sixth-generation Altadenian who created the Altadena Recovery Team, ART, with her friends when fire arrived on her doorstep. And they have been for a year running distribution drives in their community. They've started creating healing spaces, yoga classes, and now with her public policy training, now she's running lobby days and policy training for people who come. They organized a listening session last weekend, and they're both providing space for people to process and also tools for people to turn that into action and advocacy.
I've just been really impressed at the amount of people that have rallied behind these efforts and really want to help. I continue to get dozens of calls from our board members and all sorts of different people who maybe weren't directly impacted by the fire, but whom are all looking what they can do to contribute to help. And as Dana mentioned, we really do have to think about the people. Those are the people that are being affected, obviously. And I've been impressed with the communities in both the Palisades and in Altadena who've really rallied together. They've been committed to rebuilding and a lot of the grassroots efforts that we mentioned previously. Just been very impressed with the spirit of the communities to rebuild their communities.
What about you, Julia?
I mean, plus one to all of that. And I think, and one of the things that stood out when we were chatting about this the other night too, and it may be appropriate for this group, is the role that philanthropy has played, I think, in supporting community and moving forward. David, you flagged earlier, we've seen kind of a historic lack of assistance from the federal government here in Los Angeles in response to the fires, and private philanthropy has really stepped in and helped us to move forward. And a lot of the innovative efforts that are, helping communities recover here in Los Angeles are funded by private philanthropic dollars, and so we wouldn't be able to move forward without that. And I think the fact that philanthropy has been there to move the ball forward and as a backstop has really given me hope that we can continue to advance even when things feel uncertain at the level of government.
And at the end of the day, we're an educational institution, and I can tell you at least 24 students have dropped by my office in the last 2 years saying, "What can I do? As a student, how can I help?" And so that's very heartening as well. The younger generation is also thinking about this and how they can contribute to the recovery.
We had so many students who wanted to support any kind of work we were doing. We formed a whole new organization called the City Lab Coalition of this really vibrant group of young people who are dedicated to doing architecture and urbanism and planning in thoughtful, smart new ways. So I get a lot of hope from that.
Our students are so amazing. Our law students were not only out there, I mean, just doing direct assistance with food and shelter and supporting in that way, but they were helping folks review legal documents and helping them get organized and make contact with insurance companies and do all of the things that you need to do in the wake of a disaster. It's been just so incredible to see our students jump in like that. Judith, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I know you have some final remarks that you wanted to make.
I especially want to extend a heartfelt thank you to you, Julia, for so capably moderating this discussion today. And also a big thank you to Dana Cuff, David Eisenman, Tim Kawahara, and Megan Mullen for your time, your expertise, and all the information you have been able to generously impart to us. You all do such important work, and we are so proud that you are part of UCLA. I also want to thank the Women in Philanthropy members and other supporters for participating in our webinar tonight. Also, a big thank you to Juan Mija from the wonderful development events team for helping with the Zoom logistics, as well as Gina Alva Evans and Priscilla Diaz for your help. Our next community event will be in November, so please keep a lookout for an invitation from Women in Philanthropy in the fall. And with that, again, thank you all, and good night.